Call Minister, most of the priority questions this morning relate to the crisis in student accommodation. So that's a very strong indication that there's been a failure by government to plan ahead. In Sligo, for example, we had 2 apartment blocks that for 10 years housed students. Then they were allocated for Ukrainian refugees. That has been stopped for now, but the owners have said that they are not for student use. Now, Minister, that's a failure of coordination between 2 different government departments, and it has left students scrambling for accommodation in Sligo.
It's not that, actually. It's grubby behaviour that I think should be called out as exactly what it is. The government could not be clearer that student accommodation in Sligo will not be used for anything other than students as far as the state's concerned. And I am beyond disappointed that despite that message being clearly conveyed, that there's private student accommodation sitting, to my understanding, largely idle. I'm very clear around the planning conditions attached to that, and I hope everybody's very clear around the planning conditions, because we have planning laws in this country and they need to be abided by as well. That is student accommodation and it needs to be used for students. Anyway, I'll come back on other issues another time. But let me be very clear. We worked very hard, and you worked very hard with us, to establish a technological university in the Northwest ATU. It's going well, but a core part of this is absolutely having access to student accommodation. Making sure that people, not just from the region, but from outside the region, including international students who come to ATU, have accommodation as well in Sligo, and I know that is a particular concern too. I've agreed a protocol with the Minister for Children. Everyone in this country wants to help with the humanitarian crisis, 100%. I'm really proud of how people have opened their homes, their hearts, their minds, their communities to welcoming people from Ukraine, but I'm also very clear that from a social cohesion point of view, student accommodation is for students. That's what it's needed for. We make it available outside of the time. We make it available when it's not needed, but when it is, it needs to be used for that too. So we have a clear protocol in relation to that. It is really disappointing that despite so much work, the private market, if you like, has still decided not to make this accommodation now available to students. I hope people reflect on that. I really would appeal to their better nature to do that. But what this teaches me, quite frankly, is that we can't be reliant on the private market. I mean, it is the best example of why we need to build our own accommodation. And we have allocated, as you know, €1 million to the technological universities to come up with plans for student accommodation. And what I can tell you, Deputy Harkin, hand on heart, is when ATU and others come forward with accommodation plans in 2024, government will be forthcoming in supporting them advancing this, because this shows the vulnerability that if you're reliant entirely on the private market.
Thank you, Minister. And I heard what you said about grubby behaviour. We won't have the debate now, but it's my understanding that this is as much about a failure of coordination in government departments as anything else. As I said, we won't have the debate now, but I will speak to you about it again. Look, I do recognise there's been a lot of good work by Students' Union, by the ATU itself in trying to get families, host families for students, and a colleague of mine, Councillor Marie Casserly, is helping to link up families and students. But as you said, Minister, we need to look at the longer term, and the President of Sligo ATU has said she welcomes the task force set up to look at ways that Sligo ATU can borrow money to build their own purpose-built accommodation. But Minister, I think we need to see a real sense of urgency about this, because we know all of this takes time, and what we don't want is this time next year with you as Minister, and maybe 2 years down the line with some other Minister, perhaps even you, but some Minister still answering questions about the lack of availability of student accommodation.
No, I take the point. I just want to say one thing on the record, in the hope that it is helpful, because the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration, Youth have confirmed to my department that no contracts been entered into with the owners of the property in Sligo, which were previously used as student accommodation, for the provision of emergency accommodation for the upcoming academic year. And in addition, the department has also confirmed that it has no plans to acquire this property into the future. And I say that to be helpful to everybody locally. I want to thank Dr. Orla Flynn, the President of ATU. She's working extraordinarily hard on this issue, but also on that bigger issue in relation to student accommodation as well. Let me be really clear. We want to see Sligo and ATU be able to develop student accommodation. We do want to see it happen at pace. That's why we're doing a project called Standardised Design. I quite frankly think as we start to invest in building new student accommodation across the country, we should be making it much quicker to pull down a design that works in Sligo, that could also work in Tralee, that could work in Athlone, work in Carlow, and get on with it. I think 2024 will be the year in which we can make real progress on student accommodation in the regions.
Minister.
Thank you, Minister. But we also, I think, need to look at short-term solutions. We've spoken about the long-term, about accommodation, but we need proper coordination and extra bus routes to help get students to ATU Sligo. And I'm pleased to say I think a new local link service started from Ballymote this week, but we need more. Minister, we need to look at extra services within a radius of, let's say, 40 to 50 kilometres from Sligo. Time and time again, I've spoken about the need for extra services from Ross's Point, only 7.5 kilometres from Sligo town, and yet people can't get buses into the town. And Minister, we have a situation where local link is precluded from putting on a bus on the same route and at the same time as a bus Éireann bus. Yet, Minister, the demand for bus places has escalated. And I think we need to look at the actual demand rather than rigid rules about who runs the service. And I think even that, in the short term, that piece of coordination could work well.
I think that's a sound suggestion, and I'll certainly undertake to talk to the Minister for Transport in relation to this. I mean, this can't be, and I'm not suggesting it is, but there can't be any kind of bureaucratic reason here as to why we can't all pull together to try and come up with short-term solutions. I think the digs, the rent-a-room is one. I'm not suggesting it's absolutely perfect, but I think it is one. I think the transport issue is an interesting one. Also is the idea of a devolved capital grant, so giving to the universities, particularly the technological universities, a degree of discretion if they have an ability to do something local, maybe on their own campus, or with any other properties that can be changed. That's something I'm looking at in the context of the budget as well. So look, I'm happy to keep in touch with you and the Sligo deputies, my colleague Deputy Fian, on these matters. I know how difficult this has been for Sligo. I want to, in the time available to me, just acknowledge, as you did, the positive role played by the Students' Union in Sligo, who found themselves in a very, very difficult position. I mean, students want to support the humanitarian effort. They absolutely don't in any way, shape or form want to get caught up in a them versus us discussion that was completely uncalled for. I welcome the fact we have the protocol now. I welcome the fact we have the clarity, but it does show how we can't be reliant just on the private market for student accommodation.
Thank you, Minister.